gotta tell somebody.
This is the best thing I've ever seen.
Let's talk about that.
You need this. Listen to this.
Memorable and exciting.
Well, then be less boring.
I'm going to tell everyone. Wait here.
Mighty remarkable, Big Daddy. Remarkable?
Welcome to Remarkable, a podcast for B2B marketers that deconstructs the most iconic moments in film, television, pop culture, and advertising for a single purpose: to give you, the B2B marketer, the same storytelling techniques that the pros use. In each episode, you will learn techniques from Hollywood, Pixar, Marvel, and beyond, from Spielberg's hands to yours, bringing remarkable content ideas to you every single week. I'm Ian Faison, CEO of Caspian Studios. This is Remarkable. This week, we're going to be talking about B2B marketing lessons from comedian Mike Birbiglia with the help of our special guest, host of How Stories Happen, Jay Acunzo.
My physician asked me, do you have a history of heart disease in your family? I go, well, my dad had a heart attack when he was 56, and actually his dad had a heart attack when he was 56. So I've always thought I should set aside that whole year, get an Airbnb by the hospital, and keep a flexible schedule. I think that might be a big year for me. She said, well, based on your family history, I would recommend you do cardio. She said, what about swimming?
I'll be better than I was before, a natural.
Jay, how are you?
Hey, Ian. Good to see you.
Great to have you on the show. Finally, at long last. You know, we've known each other now for what is like literally a couple of years, which is insane to sort of think about. But this is going to be super fun, and I love the topic.
Yeah, I immediately went into my very short list of things I consume that don't have children's characters in it, because I have two very tiny kids at home. I was like, what is it that I pay attention to that is actually my choosing? And Birbiglia tops the list right now.
So why the heck did you pick Mike Birbiglia?
I am a sucker. So he has a podcast, in addition to being a stand-up comedian, he has a podcast called Working It Out. And I am a sucker for two things that he does exceptionally well. The first is a dissection of, or the displayed like access to, the minutia of making things. I love when two craftspeople get together and talk about what they're making. Now, most of my time is spent doing that on my podcast, How Stories Happen. That's the concept we have. It's an expert or a creative professional dissecting a signature story piece by piece, whether you're an author, a speaker, an entrepreneur, a content creator of some kind. There's Song Exploder in music, Good One, which is a dissection of a single joke in comedy. And Birbiglia's isn't the journalist talking to the comedian, it's two comedians talking on his podcast, Working It Out. And a big piece of the runtime is working out real material. So I'm a sucker for that. And I'm happy to talk about why, but suffice it to say, it's where you learn how to do the work. I think there's a quote attributed to, I think, Picasso, which is that when two artists get together, they're not talking art theory, they're talking turpentine. Where can I get good turpentine for my work, right? It's in these hot, like very specific, narrow things and tiny machinations of making that all the good stuff unfolds, in my estimation. So I could listen to two comedians. I do often do that. I could listen to actors talking about acting. I could listen to podcasters talk about podcasting. I could quite frankly listen to two people who paint wooden coasters with pictures of frogs talk about that. And if they're excited about it and they can both philosophize about it and also talk about the technical elements of it, I'm hooked. So Birbiglia does that on his show, and everywhere he goes, he likes to dissect comedy and the craft of comedy. I love that. And also it helps that I'm a public speaker in part. So there's a, not apples to apples, but close comparison to that world. And then the second thing is I am also a sucker for stories that tip a little bit close to that edge of too saccharine, too sentimental without going over the edge. I love stories by, Birbiglia does that exceptionally well in his specials. Stories by Anthony Bourdain. You name the author here, you name the writer, speaker, communicator here. If they're willing to put me in my feels and do so in a way that doesn't feel cliche or a little bit too much, I love that. And so you'll find that kind of style in my writing too. So Birbiglia does both of those things really, really well.
Meredith, who the heck is Mike Birbiglia?
So Mike Birbiglia, people often know as like a stand-up comic, but he actually thinks of himself as a writer first.
That is Meredith O'Neill, our amazing producer extraordinaire.
So aside from being a comic, he's a podcast host, like you mentioned, Jay, of Working It Out. He's also a director. So he's like across different mediums. And he has a movie called Sleepwalk with Me. And when he was talking about the creation of it, he said it took 12 years to make. And he said, that is how long everything takes, about 8 years longer than you think it will take. So I thought that was interesting. And he has definitely seen disappointments in his career. Like he said, somewhere I thought maybe I'll end up with my own sitcom. I created a network pilot for myself 8 years ago. It didn't get picked up to air. In retrospect, it was the best thing that ever happened to me because I ended up making all these projects outside of the system. I made 3 one-person off-Broadway shows and 2 feature-length screenplays and films. I feel sort of lucky. So that was really interesting. He really is like trying out all these different mediums, different ways of writing, different ways of creating. And Mike Birbiglia isn't alone in this thing, that stand-up is largely based on the comedian's own experiences, right, for his comic material. So he really uses his own life, even for directing, to like Sleepwalk with Me. So he talks about how he's had an issue with sleepwalking. But in The Old Man in the Pool, which is a special I know he wanted to talk about, he talks about getting bad news about his health, being in an Uber that hits a pedestrian, getting hurt while sleepwalking.
It's very personal. Like it's an autobiographical story about my own health and thinking about mortality and life and death.
And those are all like super negative experiences, like very can be tragic. So he really deals with dark subjects through humor.
Finding the humor in the things that are the hardest.
He says, of course, like there's nuance there. He said, that's what you always have to think about when you're writing jokes is sort of, where's the line? And you don't want to cross it, but you want to go near it. And, you know, it's subjective sort of where that line is. And that's where it becomes complicated.
And so I had this fear when I did it, like, oh no, like what if this is really hard for people to hear who are going through losing people and all that stuff? And actually it was the opposite. It was this thing where people would come up to me after shows and be like, I just, lost my dad, I lost someone in my family recently, and that's what I needed to hear right now. Like I needed to laugh. It was hard for me to laugh for a long time.
And so thinking about his creative process, his writing process, a few like sort of parallels with marketing come up for me, which is like using humor to address negative experiences often like hits home with your audience. You define how you think about your role and process, like how he thinks of himself as a writer versus a comic or director or podcast host. Creative work takes longer than you think, and maybe not 8 years longer, like you said, but will take longer. And I think that's just like you need to sit with content. You need to like think about it more. And it's definitely like a different wavelength you have to be on versus just like, getting something out to check a box. And one thing I was thinking of is like, if you end up at sort of like a dead end with a certain project, like move on to something else in the meantime and keep going. And you can always go back to that because of course, when he had that pilot rejected, he was off doing other things too and found success there. And the last thing I would say was like, create autobiographical work, like use your own life as material for your content. Because I feel like then it sort of like rings truer. It's more likely to hit home with your audience. So Jay, like all of that said, like what about his creative process excites you or inspires you?
There's a ton of comedians out there, which behind the scenes may or may not be very thoughtful about the craft. I'd argue if they're doing it at a high level, but mostly if they have staying power, they are. You think about Jerry Seinfeld, and he's written books about this. Is This Anything? That's the title of his book. And I've adopted that in my world of content creation and public speaking as well. And so his show, his specials, his social media presence, everywhere he shows up, these are not people who are just there for yucks. They're there because you come away thinking, feeling.
The strength of the writing is that he really wants it to have a depth of feeling that traditionally like comedians don't go for, and yet still have a really funny line like every 15 or 20 seconds.
Like, I think that ultimately is the goal of every communicator, whether you use humor or not. On a stage, as a speaker, I'll use humor. On a mic, on a camera, places I show up in my writing, yes, I will use humor. But I was a total ham before someone said, go create content for a living. It's who I am. But what I found is humor allows you to get somebody outside of the head trash that they're grappling with and opens them up, kind of like you're beyond their natural defenses once they laugh. It opens them up for the wisdom, for the hard truth, for the change you're there to propose to people to actually stick. You lower their defenses by getting them to laugh. But humor's one way to do that. I mean, you can do that with any kind of story, really, because a story could be about literally any topic. And if you're an effective storyteller, you can sort of deftly tie that back to whatever topic you're actually teaching. I have signature stories that are about a turtle I saw with my daughter at the aquarium, or making espresso in my kitchen and why I agonized over not doing that for many years. And you might not care about or know what it is to do either of those things. You might be thinking about your job, but I've practiced those stories enough and put them in front of enough audiences, both live and virtually through content, that I know how to make the transition between talking about whatever the heck I was going through or I am interested in and some kind of insight that you really, really need. And you can do that really poorly, but with practice, I think that's the hallmark of a storyteller, is you can talk about anything at all you want and translate that over to whatever it is you have to say or others need to hear.
How would you, if you were telling a friend, like, hey, you should go check out Mike Birbiglia, what's your like elevator pitch?
I think if you want a comedian or a storyteller that helps you think and feel something new and different while at once feeling seen on stuff you're going through, that's the guy. I mean, he does these amazing themed or premise-led shows. Every comedian uses a premise for a joke. That's how a joke holds up. It's, you ever notice how toddlers start crying the moment you start to talk to another adult? I can't then tell you a joke after that statement about my very respectful toddler indeed. Like the premise is an assertion you're making from which everything else follows. And that's true in comedy. It's also true in how you position a brand and every project that you or your brand might create. A podcast has a premise, a video series, a book, a speech. We all need to better develop our premises the way a comedian does, I think. But what Birbiglia does that's kind of become a signature thing. You heard in the description of his bio, he's done a few Broadway shows, one-man shows. And that word is important, shows.
I've done 5 shows, Sleepwalk With Me, My Girlfriend's Boyfriend, Thank God for Jokes, the new one, and now The Old Man in the Pool, and yeah, it's my favorite one I've ever done.
He has a premise for his show. There is an arc to it. That is so refreshing to me. It's not just joke, 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 joke. The jokes, I picture it like a horizontal tree. Picture like a felled tree, a horizontal trunk. That's the sort of through line. But then there's all these branches he takes, where he'll start you talking about, being a new parent. That's his special, the new one. Or The Old Man in the Pool, which is about facing his mortality and aging. You start down the trunk in this forward progression and you think okay, that's just sort of this plotting idea. And then he starts to take you away from that. He'll start taking you on this tangent about like going on an errand to Walmart. And then he sees something on the drive, and now you're visiting that with him. And for 2 to 3 minutes, you sort of forget that he was en route to Walmart, and you're laughing or thinking or feeling, maybe even crying a little bit. And then after the big emotional punchline, there's a pause, and he goes, so I keep going to Walmart. And you're like, oh my gosh, we're back in. Like, it's genius, right? So to me, the punchline, well, I shouldn't use that when we're talking comedy. The sum up is every comedian is there trying to make you laugh. Mike Birbiglia is deft at trying to help you see something a certain way, and comedy is his main tool for doing that. And I just love that.
Interesting.
And by the way, this is a one-to-one translation to our world of marketers. Like, we are trying to help people see something, think a certain way, take an action, and we are so stuck on the superficial way to do that, right? Case studies, lists of features and benefits, just this plodding, straight ahead, bland, boring, nothing burger. It doesn't really differentiate the way we communicate. It doesn't resonate that deeply. We don't feel any kind of urge to act. I like to say that you should care more about resonance than reach to grow your business. It's because from resonance comes action, right? It's better for the soul. It's also better for business because that's why we start to care. If it doesn't resonate, we don't care. If we don't care, we don't act. Like Birbiglia is just so good at making you care, not just about him, not just about the joke, but about whatever premise he is there to explore through the arc of the show. To me, that sounds like a campaign or your podcast or your newsletter or your overall brand message.
Either that was the world's slowest elevator or the world's longest elevator, but it's all great. The reason why I asked that way particularly is I was not familiar. I'd heard him. He has a very unique name. So I wasn't familiar with him at all. And It's interesting that you said that he has such a sort of unique characteristic, the thumb test, if you were to, put your thumb over Mike Birbiglia. I didn't even know what he looked like. I'm not the biggest stand-up comedy fan in the world or anything like that. I have consumed a lot of it in my life, but I don't often just sit and watch specials or anything like that, for example. But I hadn't, again, knew of him, but hadn't heard any of his stuff. And so that's why I was curious about the elevator pitch is if you were to distill it into a short thing, into the essence of what makes him different, that...
Yeah. You're on a journey with him. Every time you're showing up with him, you're on a journey to try to change the way you see something. He's a storyteller. That's what a storyteller does. And yes, lots of other comedians tell stories, but there's a difference, I think, in the way a truly effective storyteller can move you. and put you in the seat with them.
I think what you're sort of getting at there, I just finished Steve Martin's masterclass, which, by the way, holy smokes, it's a tour de force. And, you know, if you're to compare the two, which we don't necessarily need to compare the two, but just for reference, like Steve in the 70s is like, he's just trying to get people to laugh. You know, so like he's doing all these like very silly things, which at the time nobody did, but he was doing, right? All these juxtapositions of like,
totally.
I'm going to wear a suit and I'm going to pretend like I'm this very sophisticated guy, but I'm actually pretty dumb, but also I'm really smart. You know, it's like all these sort of things. And so, but it's...
Was this the masterclass or the documentary? Because he brings it up in the documentary on Apple TV Plus as well. It's super, like, it's very revealing about his evolution. I thought it was incredible.
In the masterclass. He talks about like all of the sort of like creating himself as a character and all that stuff. It's really good.
People who are overconfident, he liked to say, feel like buffoons to him. So he just went at that harder, right? He wore the suit. He had the bravado for effect, right? Doing it so far into the extreme that everybody knew he was in on it too. It was genius, especially at the time.
And then you throw in the banjo, and then you throw in like you do the balloon animals and all this other stuff, which like
the balloon, the arrow through the head, totally. You know, I think there's one line that sums up what Birbiglia does differently, and it's a line that takes some explanation, but if you see it, you hear it once, you'll see it everywhere. The line is, that's the thing about. Most storytellers stop before the overt or implied moment where you're going, well, that's the thing about getting older. Well, that's the thing about taking risks. Well, that's the thing about marketing. And then here's the insight you need. Like some storytellers give you space to synthesize that in your own brains, but some spell it out for you. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. But, you know, certainly as a business speaker and podcaster myself, or a coach or the head of a membership, I'm often spelling it out. So most people don't do that in comedy. They're not saying, you don't feel like you have a somber point at the end. The way Birbiglia kind of like causes you to sit still and sort of like not want to move because you want to just exist in that pocket, in that moment. And he does it through both spelled out and implied moments of going, well, that's the thing about the theme he is exploring in this special, the insight from that particular story or the whole special at large. To me, that's where the magic is for someone like him.
Well, I think to your point earlier that most comedians are stringing together a series of jokes, sort of it's using circuit technology. They're in series, not in parallel, right? Where it's like one begets the next one, but it's not sort of like connected, right? It's like they're going to connect their jokes with sort of like those interstitial type connections. But like really, this joke does not necessarily like pull, you know, like if I was to do a stand-up about being a suburban dad, it's like, you know, I can bring all these different sort of pieces of being a suburban dad into it, but it's really, you know, probably going to be a collection of jokes. Whereas I've thought about this a bunch because I someday want to write a special. Whereas if it was actually a story about the lessons that my dad taught me about being a suburban dad, then all of a sudden now it has this through line of starting at a place where I wasn't a dad and I was a kid to now I'm a dad. And I see my dad again for the first time because I'm like, oh shit, I'm a dad now, right? So anyways, like I've thought about that, you know, a ton. But it's the sort of like the difference between those things is like one is a collection of jokes, whereas one is a story in which there's all of these funny stops along the way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people believe that Birbiglia's style is maybe like more lightning strike moments or the gift he was given. And I do think there's always something in anything creative, like there's always something ineffable about the person, process, what this creative stuff is, sure. But because he's let you in on the process. I mean, I mentioned Good One, which is not Birbiglia's show, but a Vulture podcast where a comedian shares a single joke and then they deconstruct it. Good One also became a documentary special on Peacock, and it featured Birbiglia's process. And I was watching it and I was like, this is amazing because it's a visual version of what I get by being a fan of his anyway, right? Like he leaks out parts of the process. And what you learn is he and others like him, this is what a pro does in his world. It's not just unique to his style, but just being a professional, viable comedian, is you are constantly working on material in front of the audience. Like it is democratized to the degree that the audience decides. They don't decide exactly what you say or what's funny, but you're trying to put things in front of them. You're like, I am convinced this idea or story matters. Then you're trying to articulate the right way into that, or the right construction and flow of the setup and the punchline and the tags, or, you know, how you explain things or the timing of it all, or your callbacks, all these sort of hidden elements that go into, yes, a comedy special, but really standing up in front of anybody to speak to them. And the goal is to put enough reps in that you work the material out. And if there is one takeaway in like all my time spent with this one individual or artist like him, it is that we need to sort of reclaim creativity from what we have lost it to in the business world, which is like lightning strike moment, random stunt, something big, to what it actually is, which is the sum total of lots of hidden choices and lots of like aerating and iterating and working on the material. Like you might have conviction around your ideas. You're not going to drop that conviction and go, I'll say anything that'll work on a social network, which is what people in business are too prone to do. You have an internal conviction about how the world should be, how you see something, your perspective, even one specific idea for a project. And the hard work now is not hyping harder than everyone's saying it your way. The hard work is I have to figure out the language and the storytelling and the frameworks and the construction of my words to get people to see what I already see and go with me on the journey there.
Yeah, it was interesting when we were creating Murder in HR, and after it launched, and it was doing really well, and it got picked up by a bunch of places and features and all that sort of stuff. And we were like, obviously, it's very exciting, and we were pumped about all that stuff. And someone was like, asked me sort of like, well, why do you think this one like is a hit? And I'm like, well, we kind of built it in like every way that we could build it within resources to try to be something that's like commercially viable. Like one of the things was like the name, and one of the things was like something else, and like all these other little things that were in there. And it was funny because one of the people, sort of like, well, what about, XYZ? And I'm like, you can't sort of like pick at one thing about a project and be like, that's the thing that made it popular. It's like, no, it's like I spent a decade trying to figure out, a story that I wanted to tell that in business that would be commercially viable, and put a lot of, thousands of podcast interviews and all sorts of different stuff like into that idea. There's so much about comedy that's about like clipping the joke and posting it on Instagram, and people see that stuff, right? Whereas like, to your point, maybe this is why I haven't seen a lot of Birbiglia stuff, is for whatever reason, it feeds me, the algorithm feeds me different comics. I don't know why, but some things are best like left unclipped. You know what I mean? It's like to have the totality of the thing where you get all of the work that the person put into it for this thing, to see the entire thing or listen to it is the utility. It's like, it's not to just listen to a 5-minute or 1-minute clip. And like a lot of people design the opposite way.
Totally. Yeah, I do think that when you are a commodity thinker or expert, you start intentionally. This is about calibration. This is a portfolio approach, not an either or. So I just want to caveat that before I say what I'm about to say. You start intentionally over-indexing on or focusing too much on the asset needs to be inherently distributable later, right? Versus what is it that I actually have to say? What is the best way to do that? And yes, of course, we need to ensure that this is viable. Now, by the way, the best way to do that is to ensure that the few people you already reach who already trust you adore it and speak kindly of it to your friends. And oh my goodness, most people in business don't do that, right? They think they have a reach problem when they're putting work in front of a very small group of people that already likes them, by the way. They've already won them over. And that small group of people is signaling that the work isn't really that great. And then suddenly in business, why do we go, okay, our biggest fans don't like that. I better put it in front of way more people. That makes no sense at all, right? But then there's also, to your other point, like when you zoom in on what this actually is, it is this collection of lots of these hidden choices that, to your point, you can't just point to one and go, that's why it worked. But that's what everybody wants. Everybody wants advice that looks more like a diet pill, right? A simple secret, a single hack, a silver bullet. I think about my show, and I realize like I'm trying to dissect somebody's signature story. Maybe it's a speaker and they tell the story every speech. Maybe it's an author and they just published a recent edition of their newsletter, or they have an upcoming draft. Whatever the case, I'm asking somebody to do something pretty vulnerable, or at least important to them, which is, hey, can you share this story end to end in, 2 to 5 minutes on my show? And at the end of that, what I noticed I was doing, and this is to your point on the little decisions you can't rip out and say, it's this that makes it successful. I noticed I was smiling at them and saying, how did it feel? Okay, so I was doing that several episodes. Then I start promoting the podcast, going on other shows and being interviewed. And whenever I got a question that maybe sounded similar, what did I do? I immediately shrank. I immediately started couching my power and diminishing my idea's worth, because nobody wants to be like, it's amazing, that was the best thing, right? You start finding flaws in it immediately, or you're almost apologetic in any nice thing you say about the piece because it's your work or you. And so I realized like, that tiny moment, while you can't point to that to some executive presentation and be like, and that's what's going to grow the podcast. I really truly think it matters from the success of my show to nail what happens when I come out of the story. What is the first thing out of my mouth after they finish reading or performing that story? It can't be, how did it feel? So what I've done since, and it's worked much better, is I pick one narrow thing, one very tiny thing that's so geeky that like, I'm sure they noticed it, but thought nobody else would. And I praise it, right? Because they light up, they get warmer. They tell me of the story of adding that little whatever joke or aside or callback or turn of phrase or whatever. And then we're running free after that. So they're in the headspace and the emotional place to sure critique their own work after that, right? So I can't put that in some kind of P&L or spreadsheet to go, and this is going to be instrumental to grow the show. But I am 100% confident that it contributes to that.
Do you think that there is something that a marketing leader who's sitting here listening could do to their content to not necessarily make it more like Mike Birbiglia's, but to use that same ethos to create something great?
Yeah, I mean, there's a golden rule to storytelling, right? Which is get them to the end. We're so many shows, they don't pass muster. They fail the sniff test immediately. Like here's what to expect in B2B. You're going to get this really highly produced theme song, maybe custom, maybe stock. It's going to sound crystal clear. Then you're going to get the most bored sounding human being, usually a white male, introducing you to the show and saying who they are and what the show's about in meandering fashion. Not crisp, not punchy. It's not an event, even though it should be. And then they're going to introduce you to the guest. The voiceover that you're continuing to listen to will introduce the guest. Today on the podcast, I'm really excited. It's going to be Ian from Caspian Studios. Ian is the CEO of this amazing production company that actually does a lot in the corporate and B2B worlds, but they have ties into Hollywood, and you're going to hear about that. And I'll start to summarize you and then maybe summarize the episode. And then what happens when I end that, I go, well, without further ado, here's my interview with the great Ian, and I'm asleep, right? Like I don't even get to the point where you introduce, where the guest starts to speak. And if I did, by the way, what would I hear? I would hear the same host sounding even more tinny, saying the same things all over again. What are we doing? Like, we're going to say the same things all over again. All right, well, Ian, welcome to the show. On this show, we try to do this. Ian, before we get started, tell me about yourself.
I know.
You just told
Drives
me.
me crazy.
The voiceover just told me. Like, what are we doing? So I think this comes back to this 1-2 punch, this 1-2 problem. One is we are trying to grab attention all the time as marketers. That's not what good marketing is. Good marketing is not about who arrives. It's about who stays. So get them to the end. That's your golden rule all the time. They hit play, be paranoid now, they're going to hit stop. That's the first. The second is a lot simpler even. Athletes watch the film of the game to get better. Marketers need to consume their own content to get better. Not in the edit, but I do this in my newsletter, I do in my inbox, I do this with my podcast and my podcast player of choice. Go for a walk, open it up in the morning, do what you have to do to consume your own work. You will notice very quickly what went wrong and what went well. It's like reading your writing out loud is the best, most foolproof way to improve your writing. You need to consume your work like the recipient, right? And if you can't spot a few things there, maybe somebody else should be hosting that show. The front of my face now is just flat because I just bang my head against my desk over and over again, caring about creativity and quality, but existing in the corporate world, existing in the B2B world, caring about this stuff is actually a competitive edge. So that's my message to anyone.
Oh, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the mottos of Caspian is there's no traffic on the extra mile. Like there's just not. When I sit down with the company, I'm like, the number of your competitors, they're going to go the extra mile for their show is zero. Like they are not going to do it. Yep. We are going to go the extra mile. We're going to care about the interstitials. We're going to care about all the things that matter. We're going to care about the pacing of the introduction. We're going to care about whether or not someone's introducing themselves twice. We're going to care about having actual segments that are clear and defined. Like it's like all the stuff that, other people just want to sort of like hear themselves talk or just, hit record, and because that's easier. And then now with like AI, which we don't need to get into, but just like the idea of like easier, it's like, well, like The Godfather wasn't easy to create. It was hard as shit to create. And like, that's why it's great.
Right.
And there's like so many examples of that. Like, go find me something that's great where someone, this thing was a breeze, actually. It was, like soup to nuts, easiest thing I've ever done in my life. And it's, like a smash hit. Like, no, never. And because it's original, and originality is hard. So you have to find your own voice. You have to find the voice of the project. You have to do all that sort of stuff.
Totally. If you want to see outlier results, you have to do outlier things. It's that simple. Good enough is no longer good enough. I don't think it ever was, but it definitely isn't today, where everybody can create quote unquote content. That's not the object, having content, having a podcast. That's never been the objective. It's certainly not the goal of marketing. The goal of marketing is to make sure someone cares. If you can't do that, none of the rest matters.
So you mentioned how important it is to get to the end. When we were building Murder in HR and the subsequent, series that we've been working on, was the same thing we did when we did Hacker Chronicles. One of the reasons why I chose thrillers and mysteries is because A, it's propulsive. Nothing in B2B is propulsive. So you don't need to listen to the next chapter. You really don't. And then you have to listen to the end because that's when you find out who the killer is or find out how the mystery ends. So there's an inherent delivery mechanism to get them to the end. And again, it's like when I was sitting down with someone, right. They're like, well, why blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, because it's all built into it. That's why I chose the Murderverse. That's why I chose this stuff, is because nothing in B2B forces you to get to the end. So we're going to give them something that they're very familiar with because they already listened to, a murder podcast and all that other stuff. It feels very familiar, but now it has this business side to it and these lessons and these, hidden takeaways and Easter eggs that all of a sudden make the experience really rich. And the other thing too there is the surprise and delight piece of that, which is, and I've talked about this a little bit before, but putting little things and Easter eggs in the content that some people won't get at all, but other people will get oh my gosh, he sees me, right? You talked about that about Birbiglia, where it's he sees me. It's like someone staring into my soul and I'm delivering that. And it's all those little details. Those are the things that you end up writing on the back of a napkin when you're on BART or whatever it is. You go, oh man, that should be something I should add in. Those are all created on the extra mile. Those are all done. That's not done draft 1. That's done draft 6. And people just don't get that because they've never gotten to draft 6. And they definitely haven't edited whatever that is that they created in the first place.
There's this phrase that I came up with. So I have 2 tiny children. One of them is a toddler. That toddler likes to eat yogurt in the morning for breakfast. I am Italian. I often wear dark shirts because, I don't know, that's part of the whole deal. I am a public speaker. I am a teacher of creators and entrepreneurs. And so I do a lot of Zoom calls with coaching clients, and I do a lot of virtual presentations. And I remember one morning, let's combine those 2 now. I dropped my son off at daycare, came back home, realized, 20 minutes away from this call. I prepare my coffee, I get my notebook in order, I check in, okay, who am I speaking to? How is this going? Do I have notes from a prior interaction? I'm ready to deliver at a high level, okay, Ian? And I fire up the Zoom camera, they immediately hop on and say hello, and the first thing I notice is a phenomenon that I have now named yogurt shoulders. Because you're talking about a little tiny human that wants to be picked up or has to be to get where you're trying to go, slathered all over the face in, white yogurt, putting their face all over their parent's shoulder, and I don't notice it until it's too late. So that's a phenomenon I'd go ahead and call yogurt shoulders. All right. So I start talking to my friends about that, friends with kids, people in a Slack group I'm a part of, members of the Creator Kitchen. It becomes a little thing. It gets to the point where in the Slack group I'm in with friends, we made it like a channel. It's its own little channel in Slack, and this is for all the parenting related chatter. It's called Yogurt Shoulders. And then we started brainstorming, maybe we should do a book for charity, combine our collective audiences and resources and maybe find some brands to underwrite this. And let's create a book called Yogurt Shoulders. This is my pitch to my friends. Yogurt Shoulders, all the tiny things they don't tell you about parenting tiny humans. Right? I still want to write this book someday, and I think it'd be cool to do it for charity. That is an example of 2 things. Number 1 is, I don't know what it is in my work, but that's a thing. It's in my notebook as an idea seed or a story thread. I haven't written about that in my newsletter. I haven't used it in a speech or a consulting engagement, but it is definitely the seed of a story that I could develop to then translate it over to maybe what you just said. Maybe you just handed me the insight half of the story. I talk about yogurt shoulders. What are we really teaching here? Well, we need to find those little things and give language to them that everybody in your audience is already dealing with, but either isn't empowered to speak up about or doesn't even notice. Giving language, speaking to the unspoken, problems they face, the experiences they have, that is a wonderful thing, which recedes into the nooks and crannies of where you show up. It is not the big brand slogan, right? It is not the giant project that went viral, but could make or break somebody wanting to take an action with you, right? So that's the first thing that represents. And the second thing that represents is making stuff. This is going to be radical. Please bear with me. Making stuff should be fun. We have so lost sight of that. Good Lord, we're putting it into a deck, into a strategy, into all these tips and tricks that that's what works on a social network, right? We're creating things to move people. the people that have squeezed out the joy and the soul and the spirit and the humanity of this stuff, like they're the ones that are going to keep struggling. The people that remember, wait, I get to make stuff? Really? That's the stuff that will come through, like coming up with yogurt shoulders, perhaps, in the actual end experience, which will cause someone to care, to share, to buy, to come back for more.
I made a shirt. I was just like messing around. I made a shirt when I was going to a conference for my old podcast. It was the meme of Napoleon Dynamite, and it said, they downloaded my white paper, so things are getting pretty serious. Dude, I have never had more people come up to me at a conference and ask me where I got the shirt. And it was really funny. Good. And I'm like, I don't think legally I can sell this shirt because of copyright. But it was really funny. It was,
instead of tots, it'd be like what, leads? How do you beat that one to death, Ian? Right? You're like, God,
yeah, exactly.
Stop touching my leads.
But like it hit people in the heart, right? And that same conference, Okta had come out with a shirt that said, it is a Darth Vader quote, but it's like your lack of security, upsets me. Or I'm butchering the quote. And then, dude, that thing, I mean, they had a line like 50 people long for that shirt. And it's like, this is the crux of creating shit, right? It's like, could you create the t-shirt that people would buy versus do you create the t-shirt that just has your logo? Like the Caspian Studios logo, it's cool. T-shirts are cool. When we send them to people, they're pumped up to wear it. They're fired up. It's nothing like, the white paper shirt. And I think that like, that is what creating is about. Is like, are you going to make something that is so good that people are like, wow, this is amazing. And you've created something so good in How Stories Happen. Yep. And you've created something so good in Creator Kitchen. You can go to creatorkitchen.com to check it out. And I'm curious, like, I know you obsess, I think I can fairly say obsess, over quality, over, these things. Clearly, How Stories Happen is something that is something borderline cathartic for you as well to hear how other creators make it. So it's core to who you are. But how did you conceive that show and want to make something like that?
Yeah, it's always a mess. And I think there's actually two messes you move through. And I want to be very clear, like if anybody comes across my work and likes it, I've made a ton of stuff. And yet every time I make a new thing, it feels like a mess. And I think we're in this era now where through AI or any other means like blueprints people share or simple secrets and systems they profess to have, everyone seems to want to skip the messy parts and just clean it up after, right? Or leap to the end result. And I actually think it's in the mess that you find your best. You're like not trying to gather up all the answers that you think you need to create. You have to go and create to find your answers. It's in the act of making that you figure out what you were trying to make all along, and the thing you're making gets better, and you become more visibly present and undeniably there and arresting and gripping and memorable. So you move through two messy stages, and I definitely did with How Stories Happen. The first is all internal. It's in your head and your heart, and the idea like chases you around. And so that's me consciously choosing to spend time with Birbiglia's work or other craftspeople and artists talking about the minutiae of making. And then thinking, well, it'd be so great if that existed in the world of business storytelling, wouldn't it? Oh man, yes. Right? Or, at an event, if there's a couple other professional speakers at an event with you as a speaker, that's a rare thing because you're usually keynoting events with then the people who hired you are on stage or their clients or customers, right? So at a big industry expo, when you're with friends that sort of get it, you're in the hallway being like, is that the first time you did that? Or what speech are you doing? Right? Or like, oh, you said this. Here, I have a note for you. I think if you called it back there, that would have been so powerful, right? That's where the magic happens. So the first mess is like swirling in my brain is this stuff. And then, one day, I'll say one day, I'm sure it was 15 days, spread across a year or two, I came across the Ira Glass quote, great stories happen to those who can tell them. And I'm like, that's it. That sums up what I want to make into a show. Which is basically, and he's not saying things that are story worthy only happen to masters of the craft, right? He's saying it's a craft. You go experience life, not stories, and then you put your butt in the seat and make something out of that moves people, right? It's a created act end to end from the thing you experienced or thought of to the thing that they receive as content. And no one is really putting the crafting on display, especially in our world. So we think in terms of story structure. We think in terms of abstract, externalized ideas of story, but I'm like, if you and I had the same marching orders for a story, Ian, we'd both tell it very differently. That's coming from our experience. That's coming from our humanity. That's coming from equal parts process, practice, and our posture. In other words, the craft. I have to face this idea, right? So then it's now I have form and function and process for how to face an idea, right? Okay, premise development, that's a whole school of thought. I know how to develop a premise. How does the premise inform the format? I'm going to go and pilot this thing, find the right partners for this, etc. Right? So the messy making to me, the unfocused making is where a lot of the good stuff happens. And then kind of the focused mess, now I have process to be able to build this show so I can show up here and sort of tell the story or show up on the show and introduce it to you really crisply or something like that. In other words, it's built, right? It's not just found, but there's two messes you're moving through.
How can people get involved in Creator Kitchen?
So I'm very lucky in that I spent many years as an author and speaker exclusively, and I learned that those skills, the creative skills you would develop, are very transferable to everything you do. They increase the impact of your content, and you don't have to increase your volume as a result. So what the Creator Kitchen is it's a means to thrive as a creator or a creative entrepreneur through the substance of your ideas, not hollow stunts. And so we provide education and community for people who have at least some traction, both in their content and audience and their business. And they're kind of repelled by a lot of what we see on the internet that's being taught today to grow an audience or grow a creative and audience-centric business. And so we have a waitlist. This is currently happening right now in the summer. We're talking in July of 2024. Our waitlist is open, and we enroll people for the next cohort this fall. We call them chefs because they're certainly not line cooks. They're not taking orders and assembling, commodity stuff here. They have vision, they have taste, they have craft in the center of their world. And there doesn't seem to be another place out there that cares about the craft of professional content creation, especially in our world, quite like the kitchen. So my co-founder, Melanie Diesel, and I launched it about a year and a half ago. So we're really thrilled to create a little beautiful corner of the internet for people who, if they heard this episode, are throwing up their hands going, oh, yes, I feel this way.
And our listeners can go check out How Stories Happen. It's on jacunzo.com. You can also search anywhere you get podcasts. Jay, fantastic having you on the show. Great topic. Any final thoughts? Anything to plug?
It's a practice. Like if you do nothing else, if you're like, I want to get better, I want to be like my heroes, Birbiglia or Ian and Meredith and Jay and what they do. And if you can commit to shipping on a deadline just to persist, because the reward is to hit publish on your day. If you can already look yourself in the mirror and say, I've been doing that for years, then any of the advice out there could help you. But if not, start there, right? You don't have a brilliance problem. You have a momentum problem. Solve the problem you have a creative practice. It is the absolute heartbeat of anything else you could hope to achieve as a communicator.
Fantastic, Jay. Again, it was a pleasure, and we'll talk soon.
In today's episode, you heard from Caspian Studios CEO Ian Faison and myself, Meredith Gooderham, senior producer at Caspian Studios. Remarkable was produced this week by me and mixed by Francie Goudreau. Our theme song is Solomon by Falak. Be remarkable and rise above the noise.